Next Sunday, we're going to start a new sermon series called Who Am I? We're talking about where our identities are tied up. And we're going to talk about some interesting things during the month of March. So if you have friends that are interested in those kinds of issues in particular, bring them on out. We'd love to have them. Also next Sunday, we are going to have a guest worship leader from Edmonton. So that'll be something exciting for us to look forward to as well next Sunday. But today we are going to finish our sermon series on stress management. And I'm hoping that by the end of, or getting towards the end of the sermon, we'll have time for Q&A as well. So if you have a question that pops into your head during the sermon, just be ready to put your hand up and ask it when we get towards the end. Or you can text it to me if you like. My number, you saw it up earlier there, is 780-262-0940. My phone is right here, so it'll buzz right there. And remind me to check my phone when we get to the Q&A time so I don't miss your question. So, both of my grandparents, both on my mom's side and my dad's side, grew up as farmers. And they had a very stable routine. So they would get up at the same time every morning. They would have breakfast. They would go out to the barn, do their chores. Then they would go out in the fields. They would have lunch at noon. And on my dad's side, my dad's dad, my grandpa on that side, he would always have a 20-minute nap after lunch as well. And then they would go back out into the field, and they would have supper at 5 o'clock. And then they would go back out in the barn, do the evening chores, and then they would do all kinds of different things in the evening. And usually they were in bed around 9 o'clock. And that was their daily routine, 6 days a week. Sundays was different. Then they just did the barn chores, and then they went off to church. And church time was set for 11 o'clock because that's when you would usually be finished your chores. And so the sacred hour of church basically was to fit the cow schedule. And then you would take the afternoon off and just relax and wear your Sunday best, and then you would do the chores after supper again in the evening. And that was basically their routine. And for many people today, having that kind of a stable routine is just the thing of dreams. Either a nightmare or a wonderful dream. But let's face it, most of us have chaotic lives today. Our schedules are all over the place. A lot of it has to do with work schedules. People do shift work, and then they end up working, afternoons and sometimes graveyards. And there's all kinds of different reasons for people having very, very unstable routines. And not only is it time-wise that our lives are unstable, but financially as well. The last 5 years here in Alberta, we could have never predicted that things would go the way they did with the economy. And so our lives go up and down with the financial winds as they blow in different directions. And so we find ourselves in all kinds of uncertainty because of the economy. Then family relationships are much more unstable now than they used to be. When my grandparents were around, if you weren't married, ladies, by the time you were in grade 12, you were sort of missing the boat. And you stayed married for the rest of your life. That's just the way society worked. And nowadays, things are very, very different. We are up and down, and sometimes you don't get married until you're extremely old, like me. 29 years old when I got married. I mean, this is kind of funny, but Shelley was 27 when we got married. And her dad was from that generation, where you got married when you're just out of high school, and so on. And so he actually thought, and not only thought, he told her, well, maybe when the wives start dying off, you can marry a widower. Because he thought for sure she had missed the boat, because she was already 26 when she met me, and it's like, oh man, when you're 26, it's too late. Well, nowadays, people are marrying for the first time when they're 36, 46, 56, things like that. So there's lots of instability within family relationships. Now, the other thing that we face today that they didn't face in my grandparents' day is the mental health issues that bring instability. All kinds of anxiety and depression are a major reality in our culture today, which they didn't face back in those days. And that makes people feel very, very insecure, because we have a hard time understanding what's going on with each other when there are mental health issues going on. Sometimes we can't understand ourselves, sometimes we can't understand the other person, and so there's this instability and anxiety that we face, and all of this creates stress. It creates a very chaotic life, and chaos raises our stress levels. And it can lead to all kinds of destructive ways of trying to cope with our high stress levels. And so we see all kinds of different ways that people are trying to cope, and sometimes the cures that they're reaching for are actually worse than the stress itself. So today I want to look at a passage in the Bible. And the reason I'm looking at the Bible for this is because this passage was written by a guy named Matthew. Matthew was actually first-hand witness to Jesus. And we, as a church family, are followers of Jesus. So we want to get first-hand information about the person that we're trying to follow. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 22 and starting in verse 15. And this is what it says there. Then the Pharisees came together to make a plan to entrap Jesus with his own words. So they sent some of their disciples together with the staunch supporters of Herod. And they said to Jesus, "Teacher, we know that you're an honest man of integrity, and you teach us the truth of God's ways. We can clearly see that you're not one who speaks only to win the people's favor, because you speak the truth without regard to the consequences. So tell us, then, what you think. Is it proper for us Jews to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Jesus knew the malice that was hidden behind their cunning ploy and said, "Why are you testing me, you impostors who think you have all the answers? Show me one of the Roman coins." So they brought him a silver coin used to pay the tax. "Now tell me, whose head is on this coin and whose inscription is stamped on it?" "Caesar's," they replied. Jesus said, "Precisely, for the coin bears the image of the emperor Caesar. Well then, you should pay the emperor what is due to the emperor, but because you bear the image of God, give back to God all that belongs to him." The impostors were baffled in the presence of all the people who were unable to trap Jesus with his words. So they left, stunned by Jesus' words. So there's an interesting thing going on here. These guys were trying to stick it to Jesus. They were trying, just like some people do with politicians nowadays, trying to get him to say something that they could go, gotcha. And so they're looking for that gotcha moment. And Jesus handles this. He stick handles his way around this in a beautiful way. See, the Roman Empire had captured Israel, and so they were oppressing this nation. They had built an empire by invading and capturing all these different nations, and then they would impose taxes on those nations that would be sent back to Rome. And so some of the Jews felt, the Zealots felt, that Jews should rebel against these Roman oppressors and refuse to pay the taxes. And one of Jesus' disciples was actually from the group within Israel called the Zealots. So this was not, sort of a theory pie in the sky. Jesus was facing that every day as he would look into the eyes of that fellow who had passion burning, that the only way they could fight against this was to just refuse. It was like civil disobedience. Nowadays people protest and, do demonstrations and things like that. Well, in the Israeli times at that time, they didn't do demonstrations or blockades or things like that. They would just refuse to pay taxes. And so they basically had gotten to the point where they were willing to die rather than just kind of succumb to the Roman oppressors. Now, there was another group within the Jewish society who had basically just kind of said, okay, well, we'll just go along with it. They were sort of pragmatic. They were called the Sadducees, maybe because that's a sad way to live. No, that's a joke. They were actually called Sadducees. That was the name of their thinking. And they basically tried to make the best of a bad situation. And so they would make deals with the Romans and stuff like that, kind of behind closed doors, and sort of were jockeying for political power. And they kind of just resigned themselves to the fact that this is the way it was. And, they were basically just living with it. Then there was another group of people that actually exploited the situation. They would actually make a deal with the Roman taxation department, I guess you'd call it, to become tax collectors for them. And Matthew, this guy that actually wrote this, he used to do that. And they were considered traitors by the Jews because they would get a commission for the amount of taxes they would collect. Can you imagine if Revenue Canada gave commission to all the people that worked for them for how much tax they could collect? Talk about corruption. Oh my goodness. Now don't get me going on taxes here because, I have feelings about that. Our son Joel was doing his taxes yesterday. But not only would these tax collectors get a commission for the amount of tax they collected, so they were eager to get as much as they possibly could out of you, they would actually take extra taxes because they kind of had the power to just set the taxes wherever they wanted to, and nobody could really challenge them because there wasn't any really publicized schedule of how much each person was supposed to pay. So they could just kind of come up with a figure, and then only they knew how much the Romans were expecting, so they would pocket the extra. So they were actually shaking down their own people corruptly for extra money, and they were getting rich by this corruption with their own people. And so there was some strong feelings about this whole idea of whether the Jews should pay taxes or not. And you can see why when you understand some of the dynamics that were going on in that culture. And so when they asked Jesus for his take on this, Jesus knows, you are asking me to step into a very, very sensitive topic. And so if Jesus had said that they shouldn't pay taxes to the Romans, they could have actually reported him to the Romans and he would have been arrested. If he would say that they should pay taxes to the Romans, then they could accuse him of being disloyal to his own people. So it was really one of those catch-22s. It was a no-win situation for Jesus. And Jesus basically deals with this in a beautiful way, and he basically says, look, it's not an either-or situation. It's a both-and. Give to Caesar what he deserves or what he's demanding, and give to God what he's demanding. So he's basically saying, look, just have that sense of loyalty to whom loyalty is due. Now, this was a very stressful situation for Jesus, obviously, because they really thought they had backed him into a corner. And sometimes we are backed into a corner and our stress level goes way up as a result. So how did Jesus deal with this? That's what I want to kind of dig into a little bit today. What did Jesus do to help control his stress level? Well, first of all, I think the key thing that Jesus recognized was that there were some things here that he could control and some things he could not control in his humanity. Now, we won't get into what he could control as God, but in his humanity, there were some things he could not control. For example, he could not control the fact that the Romans were oppressing the Jews. That was outside of his control. Another thing he could not control was the feelings of the Jews. They would have their feelings in all kinds of different directions, irregardless of what Jesus did. Now, the one thing that Jesus could do is he could control his own answer. He could control how he felt about the situation. He could control the attitude that he had towards the Jews, towards God, towards the Romans. He could also choose to pay taxes. And he did. We read in another place where he told Peter to go and pay the taxes for both him and Jesus. And so Jesus basically is saying, by the way he deals with this situation, take control of the things you can control and let God handle the things you can't control. And if you don't hear anything else that I say here this morning, listen to that one truth. Control what you can control and let God control the things you can't control. I have to be honest with you. I often get those two things mixed up. Often, I am trying to control things that I really can't control. And I don't even realize it. And I get frustrated, I get anxious, my stress levels go way up, only to realize later there actually were some things that I could have controlled in the situation, but then I was asking God to control those or expecting other people to control those things. And so the things I could do, I wasn't doing, and the things I couldn't do, I was trying to do, and I was just making it worse for myself, and stress was going through the roof. For those of you that have been through AA, maybe even if you haven't, you might recognize this serenity prayer. It's brilliant. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. That, folks, has the power to lower our stress levels substantially. When we are focused on the wrong things, trying to control things we really don't have the power to control, like our spouse or our kids or our jobs or whatever, it just jacks the stress levels way up. And when we neglect to control the things we could control, we're really not taking the opportunities to lower our stress that we have. And sometimes we just don't have the wisdom to see which one is which. So let's just talk a little bit about how this could play out in very practical, real scenarios in our lives. Let's just take our work situation, for example. So many of us work in shift work, where, sometimes you're working one shift, another time you're working another shift, and so on and so forth. And that causes huge amounts of stress, and you may not have the power to control what job you have. Maybe that's the only job that's available to you. And so you can go around being angry and frustrated that I have to work these kinds of shifts. Now you're trying to control something that's outside of your control and is just causing you anxiety. Now, if you have the opportunity to get a job that has a better schedule, take it, by all means. But if you don't have that opportunity, don't sweat about it. Don't let your stress levels go up because of it. Accept this is your reality, and then try to do the best you can with the schedule you have. So try to create good rhythms within the schedule you have. And just create as stable of an environment as you have. Now let me say this. This might be a little close to home for some of us. You may have the power to say no to some of the overtime. Some people act as if they don't have that power and just work all the time, but most people, a lot of people actually do have the power to say no to some of the overtime. Now, often the reason we may or may not have that power is dependent on our financial situation. So let's just look at our finances for a second. If you are deep in debt, you may not have the power to pay off all your debts all at once. So don't be sweating about that and let that stress you out. But you may have the power to start paying off a little bit every month. And so take that power and use it. Start moving in the right direction. The other power you may have, actually you probably have, is to not add to your debt. Stop buying on credit. Stop racking up more and more debt and start paying cash for everything. That will lower your stress level. What about mental health? You may not have the power to control whether you have a mental health problem or not. But you may have the power, likely you have the power, to choose to live as healthy as you can. And that is something that many of us don't choose to do and pay the consequences for. Another thing that you have the power to do is to get help. To go to your doctor and ask your doctor to help you if there's a medical issue. And many mental health issues have a chemical imbalance at the root of them, or at least are part of the problem. And that's something that doctors can help us with. And many people who suffer with mental health issues don't avail themselves of the help that is available through doctors, and just go around suffering unnecessarily. And that is something that we can do, that we do have control over. Another thing is going for counseling, and which is often part and parcel with getting medical help, is getting counseling help. And many of us could avail ourselves of that help as well. So part of this we have control over, and part of it we don't. So we take the steps we can take and move forward with that. What does this mean at a spiritual level? As much as I wish this were true, I recognize that not all of us are able to come to church every Sunday. Work schedules don't allow it. And believe it or not, I actually worked in construction before I became a pastor. I get it. We had crazy work schedules, and I wasn't able to be involved in church the way I wanted to be. Maybe you have weekends off so you can go to church, but you can't go to a small group during the week. I get it. So we have situations that cause us to be out of control in some areas. So don't just lay down and die spiritually and go, well, I can't do what I want to do, so I'll just give up. There are some things that you probably can do. For example, you probably can take 10 minutes a day to spend time with God. This is actually an ancient practice that Christians have been doing ever since the time of Jesus, to take a certain time period, it doesn't have to be a lot, to spend time one-on-one, quality time with Jesus. Well, Dallas, what does that look like? Well, let me give you 3 components that I think quality time with Jesus every day should include. First is gratitude. I think it's very, very important for us to take a moment every day to say thank you for good things that are in our lives. It's very good for your mental health. It's very good for your perspective on life. And it's very easy to forget to do that. I've actually made a habit of my life of writing down every morning 3 things that I've never written down before that I'm grateful for that day. So it has to be something that I've never thought of before. And sometimes it takes a little bit of thinking, because after you've done that for a few years, you've thought of a lot of things to be thankful for. But believe it or not, as many years as I've been doing that, I'm still coming up with new things that I haven't ever thanked God for. And it's a very, very good spiritual practice. So gratitude towards God. The second thing I think is important is listening to God. We spend a lot of time communicating, trying to get people to listen to us, to our message, to our thoughts, to our feelings, and so on. But how much time do we actually spend listening? Listening is such a key thing in life, and I believe it's important for us to listen to God. So how do we do that? Well, in my particular case, what works really well for me is to read a passage from the Bible. But not just read it and then close the book and move on. I actually read it and then think about it until I get something from it. Until something clicks for me. And sometimes that goes quickly, sometimes it takes a few minutes of just thinking about it. Like this morning, for example, it took a little while before something just sort of clicked for me, and I went, yeah, that's good. That's a nugget for me to chew on today. And that is a profoundly good thing, I believe, for us to do every day. The third thing I would encourage you to do is unburden your soul to God. So Jesus actually invites us. He says, come and give me your burdens because I care. Now, you may have lots of people around you that care. You may not. Some people do, some people don't. But one thing is for sure, Jesus cares, and he is willing to listen. So I encourage you to unburden your soul to him. Now, some people do only this in their time with God. Their whole time with God is just telling God all of their sorrows. That's not the greatest. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but don't do only that. Imagine if you did that with your friends. All you ever talked to them about was how bad your life was and all the things that were weighing you down. What kind of relationship would that be? Your friends would be going, sorry, I'm busy. Sorry, I don't have time for coffee today. They'd be, making a big, wide berth around you. Because friendships don't work that way, and that's what Jesus wants with us. He wants a good, healthy friendship. So friendships are healthy when there's give and take. So we listen and we talk. We listen and talk. And this is what God wants. And so I believe those three things together will create a healthy relationship. Now here I'm going to do something that I don't normally do in my sermons. If you take the three first letters from those things, gratitude, listening, and unburdening, you get glue. Those three things are glue that will bond you with Jesus. I don't normally do those kinds of things, but I wanted you to really remember that. So just be ready. I may ask you, how's your glue going? Then you know what I'm talking about. Okay, we've got a few minutes here for questions. Anybody have a question? Okay, Holly. Oh yeah, Pharisees. Okay, so the question is, who were the Pharisees? That's a very good question. So the Pharisees were the Jewish religious leaders. And they were another sort of grouping within Israel, and they were extremely rule-oriented. So they had rules for all kinds of things. And they were really mad at Jesus because Jesus didn't keep all the rules they had, so they were constantly pestering him. So that's who the Pharisees were. Good question. Anybody else? Yes?
I don't have the answer. I thought quite myself. And I read the Word of God and He gives me an answer.
Okay.
So my thing is I have to sit down and pray and confess my sins first.
Okay.
God is perfect and I have to be according to Him.
Yeah.
That's the sin. So I have to confess my sins before I confess. Then He gives the answer in the end.
Okay.
My Bible is very, very important.
Okay.
Life
Yeah.
is the answer.
Okay.
That's it.
So Ruth's saying that her times with the Bible actually help her answer questions to life, which happens for me too. Yeah, very good. Any other questions? I'm going to check my phone here and see. Okay, regarding control, how do you figure out or apply this principle when one's marriage is spiraling downhill? What is controllable and what isn't? Wow, that's a great question. So, in your marriage, and this happens so often when I'm counseling people, the husband will come in and talk about how the wife is destroying the marriage. Then I'll talk to the wife, and she talks about how the husband is destroying the marriage. And both people are trying to control the other person, and they're stuck. So the key thing, if your marriage is spiraling out of control, is to step back and ask yourself, okay, what are the things I can do to make this better? I may not be able to fix it completely, but what can I do to move it in the right direction? What do I have the power to change? And focus on that. And if you talk to a counselor, they'll tell you that's the main job of a counselor, is to get people to focus on the things they actually can control, not try to change the other person. Because you can't do that. None of us has the power to change anybody else. Great question. Anybody else? Yes, Holly. Yes. So the flood was about 4,000 years before Jesus. Yep. Very good. So Let me just wrap up here. A few years ago, I was sitting at Tim Hortons across the street with a young man whose marriage was actually falling apart. His wife had said she was going to leave him. He was absolutely distraught, just coming unglued. And he'd never been to church before, or at least not as an adult. And he just didn't know what to do with this situation. And I remember saying to that young man that day, look, I can't guarantee you that we can save your marriage. See, what I was saying there is I don't have that power to control you or your spouse. But I said, one thing I can guarantee is if you follow Jesus, it will change your life for the better. That young man started coming to church. One day he gave his heart to Jesus and he started following Jesus in a very serious way. His wife didn't. She actually did leave him. She moved up to Grand Prairie, moved on with her life, and we sat across from each other again, and he says, well, what do I do now? I desperately want my marriage to come back together, but I can't control it. And my response to him was, well, what can you control? And so we started brainstorming together, and he said, well, I can be good to my kids, or our kids. I said, good idea. You do that. Be as good as you can to your kids. We brainstormed some more, and he says, well, I can be kind to my wife, even though I don't feel like it. I could still choose to be kind. I said, good idea. And that's what he did. He chose to be kind to her. And the story, went on, and there's lots of ins and outs to this story, but eventually she came up against a crisis in her life that rocked her to her core. And she realized, my husband, he's got something. There's some kind of ability he's got to manage crises, because she'd seen it with her own eyes, that I don't have and I need. And she knew what he had been going through well enough that she knew the difference was Jesus. And that crisis made her actually turn to Jesus. And she came to Jesus and unburdened her soul to him. And then the two of them started dating again. And they stood right here one Sunday morning, and they promised their love to each other, and they were reconciled after 7 years of separation. Huge amounts of stress that they had both encountered during those 7, or even before that, leading up to that. And they would tell you today, the key was that they learned to turn over to God the things they couldn't control, and then do the things they could do, and then just let God take care of the rest. This isn't rocket science. It's not something that you have to have a PhD to understand. You just need to understand God cares. He will look after the things that you can't, but He does want you to look after the things you can. I don't know where you're at with Jesus this morning. Maybe you're just sort of a curious person, sort of exploring this whole faith thing. And if that's the case, I'm telling you, you're in the right place. We actually built this whole place for people like you. And you just keep on coming, because we will love to have you as part of our family. Just figure it out in your own time and in your own way. Maybe you're at a point this morning where you're going, you know what, I'm thinking Jesus is probably the next step in my spiritual journey. I need to do something about this. And if you're at that place where you're ready to say yes to Jesus, I'm going to ask the prayer team to go and stand back here. And the worship team is going to come in a minute, and they're going to sing. And while they're singing, you can just slip out of your seat, make your way over there, and these people would love to help you bring Jesus into your heart. Introduce you to him, if you will. And maybe you did that a while ago, and you're facing stressful situations right now. As we go towards the end of the service here today, I want you to just think for a minute about your particular situation. What are the things here that I can and cannot control? And am I doing what I can do about my situation? And about the things I can control, am I letting God take over? So there's two actions you could be doing. You could be saying, you know what, this I can't control, so I'm going to give this to you, God. And then there's other things you might be saying, you know what, I could do something about this. I've just not done it yet. And you make a decision here tonight or today before you take off saying, okay, I'm going to go home and I'm going to do this. I'm going to take a step. Even though it might not solve the whole thing, at least I'm doing something. So let's all stand together. Worship team is going to come and lead us in a song. And let's make some decisions together here. And then they'll dismiss us. Go ahead, Rodney.